Hi, everybody. It is Hannah from the Joseph Palumbo Center. Today we are continuing our interview series, our first one with Joe Palumbo. And today we're talking to Bill Gieseke, who is the director of JPC. So we're going to talk a little bit about his experience as a social worker. So I guess that's the first question. What got you into social work? How were you drawn to it?
I could say dragging and kicking, but I think in essence, my heading towards social work happened when I, after my junior year of high school, went with another 16-year-old at the time, myself and a 19-year-old, to work on the Navajo Indian Reservation, where I drove an ambulance and did construction work for the summer. And that became the kind of impetus that ultimately got me into social work. But it was a circuitous route because having finished that and being kind of radicalized by what were nonsensical kinds of issues for me in terms of the way Native American were treated vis-a-vis Caucasian in the general population was just mind-boggling to me at 16. But then I headed off to college to be a pediatrician as a pre-med, a biology major, and slowly but surely kind of got through biology, but wasn't that excited about it, and kept moving towards more social involvement. And then I began to do some community organizing where I went to school, Valparaiso, Indiana. And that led me to pursuing once I went to work for the Glencoe Youth Services in the early 70s to run a drop-in youth center. Led me to thinking that I really would rather do counseling than anything in biology, and I'd rather do counseling than doing community org work. And so I went and got a master's degree at IIT because social work has this idea that you can't really work and go to school, but if you're at the same time, so if you have to work to pay for your keep, then it's a little hard to go and volunteer X number of hours each week. So instead, I got a guidance and counseling degree. Eventually got traded my knowledge of community org work for more opportunities to counsel at the Irene Jocelyn Clinic in the late 70s. Then went to the Child and Adolescent Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy Program at the Institute for Psychoanalysis, from which I graduated. 5 years later, I became a faculty member there. And all along, the Institute for Clinical Social Work various faculty members kept saying, Bill, don't you really want to go to social work school and get your PhD? And eventually, in 1995, I went to ICSW, and then I think I became a social worker.
Cool. Yeah, I didn't realize that you didn't start out, like you didn't start with a social work degree. started with a counseling degree. Nice. Yeah. So, what does your kind of day-to-day life as a social worker look like? Like, what kind of? I know you're a clinician, but like, what's your specialty? What's your day-to-day life?
Essentially, I was trained to see kids, so the bulk of my practice, even at this point, is still seeing kids and adolescents. I got interested in kids who had neurocognitive deficits, and got to be pretty good at working with those sorts of neuroatypical children and their families, and was also interested in children of divorced parents. And I think it was probably 88 or 89, went out to San Francisco and trained with Judith Wallerstein and her staff at the Center for Families in Transition. Made a promise to her that I would contribute something to the literature of divorced children. And that became the topic of my dissertation. And so I could, in essence, complete my PhD and also keep a promise.
Wow. Yeah. So I'm guessing my next question is about how you got involved with JPC, and I'm assuming that kind of obviously your work at ICSW, but also specifically working with kids, neurodivergent kids, is how you got to know Joe, because that's also his specialty.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Joe and I go back a long, long time. He was the first person to interview me for the child therapy program. He and his wife, were family friends. I worked with Dottie for decades. So that's how Joe came to ask me to be involved when JPC was founded. And then when he decided that he was wanting to retire, and then he asked me if I wouldn't become the director.
Very cool. Obviously JPC is still pretty new, and I'm certainly a part of figuring out what we're doing exactly with JPC, but what's your vision for it? Like, what in an ideal land, what work you'd want JPC to do?
Well, I think the critical work that JPC is involved in is translating neuroscience findings into psychoanalytic social work. And those are two different vocabularies, two different kinds of knowledge. They don't use terms in the same way. So how you do that, how do you help people use really the really wonderful insights of taking an empathic view of your patient / client, and then apply neuroscience to helping them understand themselves, thinking about how they came to develop their personalities with neuroatypical structures. What the system that they grew up in ultimately did to help them create the self-narrative and their self-confidence about who they are in the world, and what is the story they tell themselves, and what is the story they tell the world, and how do they really maximize their potential. And so I see JPC is working right on that interface, while at the same time, because neuroscience is for lack of a better word, sexy these days. Uh, how do you translate it into practical terms? So many of my generation and people just a little bit younger than me never were exposed to neuroscience at all in any of our training. Undergraduates now get much more exposure to that. I'm not sure that you get much exposure to neuroscience in social work school going through, but clearly it's in a really important field. So how do you find collaborators to help spread the word, help understand it, help work through the knowledge base, and how do you begin to, at the same time, make yourself available as a resource to help people translate that into public policy? Much in the way that trauma has been transformed as a concept in public policy that people really think about now when we think about how to approach patients and families who've been traumatized, and repeatedly so, and children who have been essentially victims of complex trauma because of the environment they grew up in. So lots of things can be pulled together, and that's kind of what I see JPC doing. Excuse me, and working with, ICSW to kind of expand the base.
Yeah, it's been really rewarding for me to be a part of that process right now, because I have absolutely no background in neuroscience. The last time I formally did any learning about the brain was when I took biology in high school. So it's been really interesting kind of like helping y'all out with developing content, because for me, it's very new and it's very, exciting. And it's kind of, obviously, I'm a first year social work student, so it's alongside me learning like the building blocks of social work itself. So yeah, one of the things I've been wondering is, because JPC is specifically focused on obviously neuroscience, but also psychoanalytic social work, I'm wondering, like, do you see a connection between neuroscience and other modalities of therapy / social work?
There's certainly connections, whether you're doing family systems work, because then you can think about the system in which brains grow up, the communities in which essentially brains grow up and develop. I think that has a huge impact. But I think ultimately what neuroscience does is it expands our perspective and our horizon. We have to think of more ways in which events can affect how the brain develops, the way the brain develops, the neural networks that the brain develops, and then interestingly enough, we apply those. Neural net thinking is a fancy way of saying community organizing. And how do you create networks in communities? Not a whole lot different than how your brain develops, creating networks over and over and over again that get more and more efficient the more they're used. And if they're not used, they kind of are withered or arbored away, as we say in neuroscience. But psychoanalysis, despite Freud's early attempts to bridge it, has gone off in the search for meaning, but offers a very robust set of theories about development and human development from various points of view. And I think adding a neuroscience perspective just increases the power that those perspectives can create.
Yeah, I know that social work as a field, and definitely specifically at U Chicago, is really interested in pluralism and, kind of not choosing one specific modality or one specific background to approach social work and counseling with. And I think that's a very cool concept and something that I really resonate with. And I think it's specifically super interesting because historically, there's a lot of elitism between different factions, like between, the hard sciences, the social sciences, and then I have a humanities background, so there's a lot of separation and
Mhm.
elitism on all sides. And so the type of work we're doing at JPC in general, just it feels very good that we're kind of trying to take some of those walls down.
Mhm. Well, I taught normal development for nearly 25 years at the Institute for Psychoanalysis to people going through the child and adolescent program. Um, and then I also taught when the Institute reformatted itself the first 2 years of what's now called the fundamentals year. Um, and trying to think about development not so much as ages and stages, but as a systems approach, trying to bring in all of the empirical data that supports many of the psychoanalytic propositions about development. Um, has been an interesting part of my life, and teaching has always been uh, part of my practice. And um, so JPC offers me, those kinds of opportunities along with ICSW. Um, and I think that's a very exciting kind of, career path for people to pursue. Um, Certainly it caught my attention.
For sure. Yeah. One of the things that I know that we JPC as like a board and a group of people have talked about is incorporating social justice into our work. I know specifically we've been talking about race
Mhm.
uh, and how that kind of interacts with neuroscience. In fact, there will be another video coming soon where Amy and I talk about race and neuroscience. But I guess I'm curious, like in your day-to-day practice, where does social justice fit in for you? Because I think that's a very important foundation of social work is that it's by its nature about social justice.
I think it goes back to a quote. I can't remember. I probably was in college, but I may have been in high school, by Musta, which said, uh, "Peace is not the way; it is the way." And in essence, to think about process. So I've tried as best as I can to live my life from a social justice perspective. Um, and to be as aware of that as I possibly can as I carry out my practice, as I think about how the decisions I make. We know that race is a made up concept. There's no such thing biologically. We don't have races, we're all the same. Um, it was a way of trying to separate people out in a sociological way and in a way to be able to exclude people. And as we've moved away from that, um, how you think about that in terms of brain development is a very big challenge. So if we try to broaden the perspective a little bit more and said to ourselves, well, how do we think about ourselves and others? Um, and what makes an other an other? Uh, And one of the easy ways is this kind of surface thing. Oh, the color of your skin is different. But biologically, we know that the color of our skin was an evolutionary change. We all started in Africa. There are 7 kinds of mitochondria in the entire world, the 7 African mothers. But if you're dark skin and you're in Sweden, it's not so advantageous to go hunting in the snow where you stick out so much. So eventually, our skin changed and adapted to the new environment, and people who were lighter skin obviously survived longer, and we got this big separation. But we're all still human beings. And then the next kind of way of thinking about it is we're built neurologically to react to protect ourselves. Our amygdala goes off anytime we think we're in danger. Others cause that reaction. So we have to overcome that. And, polyvagal theory tries to explain how we calm ourselves down so the amygdala doesn't make us go into flight, pause, or fight mode. And that kind of wiring and those kinds of systems begin to allow us to be around others, and we got pretty good at it as a species, because as a species, we're very altruistic. We help each other because that gives us the greatest advantage in the world. But in addition to all of that, the brain releases oxytocin that helps us bond to each other. And we know in studies in Israel, working with Israelis and Palestinians, that we can, but with the use of oxytocin, you can see the release of that as people get more familiar with each other and less frightened. And, I think the findings of neuroscience help us in multiple ways to explore that, to think about that, to think about what use it ever had, and what we might further understand about it, because I think it's a very complex topic.
Yeah, this is a bit of a spoiler for my conversation with Amy, but one of the things that we plan on talking about is what I found really interesting in some reading that I did is that there's a brain difference when someone is either internally motivated to, approach things in a social justice way and approach things in a anti-racist way versus if you're externally motivated to approach things in an anti-racist way, which I think is fascinating that we can, look at someone's brain and be able to tell like how they are motivated to be a good person. But yeah, I think I've definitely kind of what I was talking about before, the division of different disciplines is there's this kind of drive to be like, well, race is a social problem, not a, neurological problem. And it's like, well, they work together. Social things affect the brain and vice versa.
Absolutely. As Rogers and Hammerstein said in the musical South Pacific, you have to be carefully taught. You have to be carefully taught. And it's the teaching that really changes the brain so that you take these kind of racist points of view. And if you've been trained or taught because that's how your society is organized, then you're going to have kind of hard, rigid feelings about this versus people who, just don't think that way at all.
Right. Yeah, no, I think this is, we could talk about this for much longer, but I don't want this video to get too long. So I guess the last question that I have is a little bit of a turn away from the topic we were just on, but what is your advice for new social workers? I say as a new social worker.
Read, 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 and read everything. Read a zillion novels, because all of those introduce you to worlds and people that help you be more empathic. Don't get too hung up about reading theory textbooks, because theories change. And but read and then expose yourself, get out in the world and talk to people, but always try and see the world as best as you can from their point of view. Because to be a therapist means you got to go back and forth constantly in your mind between their point of view and something that might be yours, and kind of figure out, what does it all mean? What's going on in the relationship? What does it mean in a general sense? And how do you move forward? So I think wide experience and reading. Now, my reading I stopped reading novels sometime in my late 30s, although I'm required by my wife to do it once a year. And I've just been off reading, essentially technical things since then. But, it's trying to grapple with all of these things that I'm so curious about. And how do I understand it? And what does it mean in terms of the work I do? So that's what I would tell new social workers. Read, read, read. Get out, have experiences, and don't take all of the school learning too seriously.
It warms my little English degree holding heart that you brought up fiction, because I think fiction is something that I think people tend to overlook, and I think it is really valuable in learning empathy and connection with other people.
Well, I think I was about 23 when I realized that I only had 2 more Faulkner books left to read, and I stopped because I couldn't imagine living the rest of my life without a Faulkner book.
Yeah. What's your favorite Faulkner novel?
I like the funny part of the Reivers, and I like The Sound and the Fury, which clearly is, one of the great novels of all time. I'm fascinated by his ability to write, but even more by his ability to punctuate. And he has sentences that go on for 142 words, which is kind of like reading the original Kohut, who was originally a German speaker and had very complex sentences where the verb was always at the end. So when I read Kohut's first book, I had to literally sentence diagram the whole thing to understand what it said.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we're gonna wrap up here.
Okay.
So for our lovely audience, what you can expect to see from us next, as I mentioned earlier in the video, I have a video coming up talking about neuroscience and race. And then Joe and I will be continuing our series on learning disorders. Next up is nonverbal learning disabilities. And then I think the next interview, I will be the interviewee. So you can learn about me, this mysterious person who showed up. But yeah, so I hope you all enjoyed that video, and thanks for joining me, Bill.
Good to be with you, Hannah.